нас є 3 магістерських програми, і я запрошую всіх охочих доєднуватись до нас. Це Master Public Policy and Governance, це Memory Studies and Public History, і 3-я програма – це Urban Studies. І зовсім скоро ми оголошимо про набір, ми будемо максимально інформувати вас, робити івенти. Тож доєднуйтесь, і з великою вдячністю, так, ви можете ставити питання в Q&A, і одночасно у нас ведеться трансляція на YouTube, а тепер я до нашої гості буду звертатися англійською. Okay, dear Emma, it's privilege having you here. Thank you for, give your time for us, for Kyiv School of Economics, for Ukrainians. And now we are in Kyiv, you are in the United States, and, you are absolutely prominent scholar. You are very famous, and just several words about Emma Briant and her topic today. Emma Briant's topic today is contemporary propaganda and digital mercenaries. It's, very actual, very timely, very needed topic for understanding. As you know, Emma Briant is an internationally absolutely recognized expert and scholar of information warfare and propaganda, who helps policymakers, governance, businesses, journalists, and just public understand and respond to the challenge of contemporary online threats. As one of the people who once, presented Emma Briant, told that very interesting information that Emma Briant has been called the woman exposing the propaganda puppet masters by Index on Censorship in 2022, and one of the world's leading experts in information wars. Her research has been featured on the BBC and in the New York Times, but not only. She is the author of the books Propaganda Machine, The Hidden Story of Cambridge Analytica and the Digital Influence Industry, and What's Wrong with Democrats, Media Bias, Inequality, and the Rise of Donald Trump. Again, thank you, and we are streaming your presentation, our discussion on YouTube, and floor is yours. Thank you, and we're absolutely delighted and waiting for your thoughts.
Wow, well, I'm incredibly flattered. Thank you so much. That was quite a build-up. I hope I can this year book on the industry. So that's kind of partly why I'm talking about this subject of digital influence mercenaries. And I think this is such an important topic that people don't talk about enough. The research I'm going to be discussing with you draws the end. Interesting. I'm going to try not to talk for too long because I really want to answer any questions that you might have as well. So I'm sure you probably have a mechanism for being able to send them in the comments in the chat. So hopefully, mercenaries. Here we go. Can you see my slides okay, Anton?
Not, I can see it. Yes.
Yes? Okay.
Yes.
Okay, good.
Yes.
Thank you. So let me just reduce the size of this. There we go. So this with people in Ukraine, with Ukrainians, I'm sure in the diaspora, who are, fighting this horrifying genocide. I'm really just, glad to be able to, to your issues. I hope this is helpful. I focus a lot on the United States, on how Russia has been using information warfare in the West. And obviously that is an important dimension in terms of Russian ability to sort of undermine the alliance around Ukraine and its ability to fight back. So
I'm sorry, dear Emma. It seems like you have an unstable connection. Maybe, maybe just you could turn off your camera, and it will be better, connection.
Okay, let me try that.
Because we can see your presentation, but
yes,
we have a problem with hearing you.
Okay. Working, yeah, okay. I just need to, sorry.
No, sorry, it's okay.
Okay, let's see, there we go. So I'll run over just a little bit about me and my background, and I'm going to talk about the 2016 I think the particular approach that I take is important. I don't necessarily research or theorize around propaganda in the same way that is currently the trend. I tend to take a slightly different approach than people in disinformation studies, which is the general way in which propaganda is talked about these days. But my experience goes back further than 2016. I've been researching this area since 2003. So I'm old school, if you like, and I tend to draw on that legacy of understanding propaganda through the decades and centuries even to understand what we see today. For that reason, I use the word propaganda rather than disinformation, but I will explain why and how and so on. My first book, actually my second book that draws on my PhD is Propaganda and Counterterrorism. And even from this early study that I was doing during the war on terror, I have taken an approach that's tried to peer into the propaganda machine. So my work for this project and my PhD was looking at Western propaganda, actually, and the war on terror and the US and British roles in the Iraq war and Afghanistan, and the ways in which propaganda was changing for a digital age during that period, the news being developed and how was acting to terrorist. And that research, I actually was also interviewing people in the governments and militaries, but also in contractors that were springing up and making an awful lot of money out of these wars. And one of those was SCL Group, was the company of Cambridge Analytica. First met in 2007 change in counterterrorism, and that sort of flourished into my exposing the company during 2018 after doing a substantial amount of research into their the US election and in the British Brexit campaign and around the world in the global South. Is everything okay? Can you hear me okay? Do you want to give me a thumbs up if you can hear me okay?
With some troubles, but we can. I'm sorry, but you still have unstable connection.
Let me see if I can close some things, see if that helps.
We can see presentation and we can hear you, but time to time, there is some problem with internet connection. And I hope, you know, maybe we will now, we'll just...
This back,
Sorry?
So yes, I was involved in exposing the Cambridge Analytica scandal in 2018, including my role as a senior researcher in The Great Hack, a film that came out on Netflix later that year. So this was basically a company working for the rest at the same time as Google for the West. One of the parts of the scandal that was most overlooked was that this was a defense contractor that had originated working with our governments, that had also been working for, you know, human rights abusers around the world. And these kinds of conflicts of interest are of the coverage of the journalist scandal and around Trump and United States led to a surge of concern about fake news, and the propaganda debates were really centralized around this particular language, which exploded into the media and wasn't terribly helpful in understanding what was really going on. And first draft and led this argument to abandon the phrase fake news and replace this with the terms misinformation and disinformation. This, what they called types of information disorder, has generally catalyzed the kind of discussion in academic circles and in wider around the since period, because these terms sought to make it a little bit clearer and more actionable. So this sort of simplified the issue for policymakers and the public, and it was popular as an attempt to also try to make propaganda apolitical. Shared facts should be agree on politics. Okay. Fake news and the focus on disinformation and falsehood specifically has led to a misunderstanding, though, of an activity as old as the language itself, propaganda, and how it was transforming in a digital age. States use many channels for influence to act a certain way, to try to rise their emotions or seek doubt, distrust, question more as our some more overt and some more opaque. But propaganda, in my definition from my book, Propaganda and Counterterrorism, is the deliberate manipulation of representations with the intention to produce any effect in the audience that is desired by the propagandist. So this essentially is an intentional activity. It's always deliberate manipulation. I have borrowed a lot from scholars like Jacques Ellul, the French classic propaganda theorist, who argued that overt propaganda is increasingly conducted so that white propaganda, that's truthful propaganda that is based on fact, becomes a cover and mask for Black propaganda. That is, one openly admits the existence of one kind of propaganda and of its organization, means, and objectives. But all this is only a facade to capture the attention of individuals and neutralize their instinct to resist. And, you know, it essentially masks the dark activities, the dark arts, as we like to call them, of disinformation, so that deliberate falsehood. So what is disinformation then, that's currently discussed so much? Disinformation is just one kind of propaganda. So it's helpful to think of propaganda as an umbrella term. And campaigns also persuade with truth, the white propaganda that classic theorists like Ellul used to discuss, and may do this in ways that obscure the source or are otherwise misleading. So that's the gray propaganda that is often referred to. These are most often used together in coordination. And although they're often used through different channels. So the new discipline of disinformation studies reorients us and actually narrows our focus away from understanding the full complexities of propaganda as a process and as an organized operation. The most toxic Russian propaganda, of course, has used white and gray in combination with black in distorting and misleading ways, exaggerating and misrepresenting neo-Nazi elements, for instance, to support a denazification narrative, demonizing and dehumanizing to legitimate a genocide, and supporting this with disinformation and fakes. Today, there are many layers of infrastructure delivering this kind of propaganda, but it actually is still the same kind of process of black, white, and gray being used in coordination. And propaganda becomes one part of an influence operation, which is another umbrella through which you can interpret what propaganda is and how it is being organized. Influence operations are coordinated attempts employing information distribution, such as propaganda or deception, with other forms of information advantage, like hacking, for instance, and data use. An array of entities are involved both as distributors and as actors or agents. States, of course, are primary. Non-profits, private industry, individuals also playing important roles. And it's important to centralize these different actors in the process of understanding an operation. So I have coined the term digital influence industry to talk about private firms for hire as a service in deliberate and often coordinated or synchronized attempts at an influence operation. So this particular service industry is incentivized very differently, for instance, to clickbait, and should be seen quite differently because its goal is a political one. It's trying to achieve something for another actor. And clickbait, so things like the sort of Macedonian clickbait farms that were set up to try to monetize Google ads to spread misleading information of all kinds. They didn't really care about the agenda, like a particular agenda to spread this message. They didn't care what message they were spreading or what they were trying to achieve. All they wanted to achieve was making money. So private firms are working for someone who has an agenda, and this is this digital influence industry. Today, disinformation studies has critiqued this pre-digital propaganda studies and often portrays it as though active audiences are a sudden new phenomenon produced by our own new technologies. In fact, classical propaganda studies is dismissed in a generalized way as being overly deterministic. So as a top-down communications model, where sender and receiver roles were typically static, with the propagandist, like the government, issuing persuasive messaging aimed at achieving a specific outcome among the target audience, the general public. Now, this classic understanding of propaganda is argued by Wanless and Burke, for instance, to be outdated and in need of adaptation in the digital age. they make a fair point about us needing to move with digital technologies. However, I think that they are too fast to abandon what we had learned from propaganda studies of past. And deterministic models of propaganda were already discredited long ago, before the internet age. And even Ellul, who I just mentioned, accounted for what he called horizontal propaganda, emanating from inside the group. Essentially, propaganda is always social. And Soviet and Nazi-controlled societies also built social networks to enable surveillance and nurture active participation in mutual propaganda. Social media today just accelerates and incentivizes and monetizes these network affordances, a process that Gale and Lawson have termed mass personal social engineering. But they're not really new. They are just part of the way that human beings communicate and social networks work. Today, it's popular to dismiss theorists like Ellul, who really centralized their study on organization and processes of deliberate actors. So Ellul said a set of methods employed by an organized group that wants to bring about the active or passive participation in its actions of a mass of individuals, psychologically unified through physical manipulations and incorporated in an organization. This was propaganda for Jacques Ellul. It was about psychologically unified processes incorporated in an organization. Now that sounds more like our social media systems today than it does anything that went before even. So this new form of disinformation studies generally focuses on online, on social media, interact with the content, and tends to overlook or leave as an afterthought the people who had created the propaganda. So it has reoriented us from this traditionally important focus on actors, concept which enable understanding of these actors is an art that we must renew to understand deliberate activities in propaganda. Private firms today on every single side of a conflict play a huge and very lucrative role in information warfare. We see still a pattern of what happened during the Manhattan Project, the United States effort to create the atom bomb, where the process of creating the bomb was essentially split up, divided, and different scientists all across the United States, different universities, and different technical were all given one separate isolated task within the creation of this overall project in order to isolate each individual process and protect the whole. Because if you exposed even one element of the project, this would expose intelligence essentially. By decentralizing the operations, this meant that they protected, even if there was a spy or something in one of these operations, it meant that the whole was not undermined. So fragmenting and decentralizing propaganda as a form of hybrid war has been a process that has flourished the last 15 to 20 years. We have seen operations now privatized and weaponized to the highest bidder for these hybrid wars, which bring them together with coercive data gathering. And this we tend to focus a lot on things like Facebook ads and so on, and disinformation, but this isn't the entirety of these kinds of operations. We see the use of is MDM, misinformation, disinformation, and malinformation model terribly well. Russia has expanded the use of cyber-enabled influence operations following its 2022 assault on Ukraine, a country which has been one of the biggest offenses. This has also driven attacks on Ukraine, with a huge spate of hacking being used to also weaponize anxiety and conspiracy theories. And an important part of this is this digital influence mercenaries industry, which I one of these service industry actors that is defined by its coercive clients and its coercive methods. So this subset of the industry is the really problematic one. We see a lot of influence firms, and some of them are doing things that are, legitimate. Maybe offering influence services without discernment to state or non-state clients backed by force and coercion, especially authoritarian clients, those violating human rights or using aggressive censorship or engaged in criminal activities. They may be offering or working with partners to enable for aggressive methods such as using information by hacking, spyware and surveillance, black ops, black or and deception. This might include, for instance, destabilization operations within civilian communities and falsely deflecting blame onto another target. So they might also be masquerading as a legitimate organization while doing this, of course. These so the digital influence that is good at influence mercenaries can be distinguished from these kinds of clickbait actors or other primary business models that might be exploiting propaganda. And it's really important to think about these different actors differently, because then we can incentivize industry more effectively to change things. Now, so of this particular service industry, I would include Cambridge Analytica. These kinds of actors often are slipping their hands into politics as well in other places. So not just content to take money out of warfare, they are also operating in ways that might also be allowing them some leverage that can be used for undermining elections, for example. And we've seen declared spending alone by the Kremlin on propaganda within the US since 2016 amounted to more than 146 million to advance Russia's interests, according to Open Secrets. But this isn't the whole industry spend. A lot of it is happening through dark money and untraceable. And even if it's small donations, it goes below the radar and isn't needing to be declared. So with more overt outlets like the Russian state-funded outlet RT's operations being undermined in some social media and other avenues in the US and UK and EU, other avenues for influence have become much more important. So these kinds of other operations that might be masquerading and using proxies. And I want to emphasize here the role of data. So with Cambridge Analytica in particular, I think what people didn't really understand very well was how they were using this micro-targeting. So micro-targeting is the use of, all the many different behaviors that you might engage in online when you click on websites, when you share posts on Facebook, or, enable tracking, for instance, is enabled usually by default across most of your social media and so on. And companies are drawing all sorts of data from your shopping history and so forth. All of this can be used to try to find, much more accurate ways of micro-targeting, they call it. So finding the characteristics that will be most likely to change your behavior and move you in a direction that is desired for the propagandist. Now, the ways in which Cambridge Analytica used this, they had managed to get hold of illegally a data set of without adequate consent for using in the US elections through researchers at Cambridge University. They managed to get this data set that was modeled according to a personality test called Ocean. So this just, we all have an Ocean profile. These are, just normal personality traits. There's nothing wrong with you for being one of these more than any other. So we all have an openness score, a conscientiousness score, an extroversion score, agreeableness, or neuroticism. And some of us are more of these than others. Now, Cambridge Analytica was most interested in some of the, more concerning campaigns that they ran with this neuroticism score. Neuroticism, as I said, just a personality trait, but Cambridge Analytica had identified it as an indicator of anxiety and tendency to worry. And they were really very interested in how to activate people using these triggers. For a film that I was researching for, called People You May Know, which is available on Amazon Prime, this particular film came out a year or two ago, and I was working with the lead researcher on that project, Brent Allpress, on researching how Cambridge Analytica worked with a company called Glue, which is a religious app developer in the United States. And they were hired by the Philanthropy Roundtable, which is a conservative philanthropy organization in the United States. And they contracted them to produce a church survey and Facebook ad micro-targeting platform with this company, this religious app developer. Millions of dollars were invested over a 3-year period. And this was aiming to both bring people to the church, but also deliver support for vulnerable groups. So relationship problems and financial problems and things like this. So they had all sorts of access to data on people's anxiety and stress levels. My colleague Brent Allpress discovered the app was being resold to political campaigns and funders without the church's awareness. So this kind of data obviously is incredibly sensitive. Brent discovered the app was being marketed to churches and mental health and addiction treatment, as well as financial advisory industries, a lot of sensitive data. So then the availability for this app, which was being sold to political actors to then be used to target people with addictions, people with depression and anxiety, is, there was very little, there was nothing to stop people using it for political purposes. Allpress found that it was also a project of the Council for National Policy, which is an organization in the United States, a networking group with very high-level conservative activists. For instance, Steve Bannon is involved, who was on the board of Cambridge Analytica and vice president. The CNP were also behind the Stop the Steal campaign, which was involved in the insurrection on the Capitol in 2021. The research, I would encourage you to have a look at the film, because it offers a lot of insight into how data can be misused for one purpose, and much to the lack of awareness of these churches that were involved. So Cambridge Analytica's data set was also, of course, being shared with a pro-Putin businessman, Konstantin Kilimnik, according to the Senate Intelligence Committee's report on Russian interference in the United States election. And amongst Cambridge Analytica's campaigns was the Make America #1 political action committee, which was running an anti-Hillary Clinton campaign, leveraged on the emails that were hacked by the Russians and circulated by WikiLeaks. As you can see, the messaging that Cambridge Analytica developed says more leaked emails, more secrets revealed, and so on. And it was used to develop conspiracy theories around the election. And this particular pack was the one that was also linked to voter suppression in the United States. So Cambridge Analytica was modeling all of the targeting for their campaigns with this neuroticism score, which they ran experiments as a part of this work for this particular pack on neuroticism, targeting hundreds of thousands of Americans with fear-driven messaging like this, in order to test how to better, energize people. They found that neuroticism led to a 20% increase in engagement of the most fearful people. So they were really finding that these kinds of fear-driven messages worked very well with neurotics. So this meant that they had managed to isolate a particular segment of the community that would respond best to conspiracy theories. And of course, so then they would upload the list of people that they had managed to identify as most susceptible to this kind of messaging onto the platforms like Facebook and Twitter and so forth. And Facebook then, of course, maximizes engaging and fear-driven content and tries to find lookalike audiences. So audiences that directly mimic and look very similar in a data profile to the list that you have uploaded. And there was nothing to stop Cambridge Analytica uploading a list of people who are neurotic. Sorry. But isn't it just dumb people who believe propaganda? Aren't people engaging with it the problem here? Well, there has been a lot in the media talking about, people as being just stupid and so on. And well, they should just, be a bit more discerning about what they consume and so on. But literally, this obviously is causing major problems with our society now. And blaming people for interacting with propaganda doesn't get us very far. It's also not just stupid people. And we can't just solve this with digital literacy or countering and pre-bunking. It overlooks the complexity of just what's going on here. Complex influence operations run by sophisticated actors often aim to manipulate mistrust that has real foundations, such as lies that enabled the Iraq War or real corporate cover-ups and spin, mixing deep truths and selective document hacks with fiction. Increasing government secrecy often results from these kind of hack and leak attacks. And those, measures that are seen as within a democracy as repressive can be further weaponized for exposés by Russia in a cycle that I call in my forthcoming book chapter, secrecy hacking. So the more that Russia and other hostile actors are putting out these anti-democracy, paranoia-based campaigns, and weaponizing leaks for doing so, the more governments tend to overreact and respond with knee-jerk reactions and increase secrecy and so on. And the more these kinds of operations can be weaponized and exposed to drive the conspiracies further. So this cycle of secrecy hacking is something that we desperately need to break the pattern of. The real problem here is an inability to know what, when, and when to trust. And some supposed solutions have been used as fuel for Russian campaigns. Ill thought through measures can backfire, depleting public trust and fueling conspiracy theories, such as in the United States, the Disinformation Governance Board, which, the public reaction was probably quite predictable, but was able to leverage a lot more harm than anything that they were able to actually do in terms of countering propaganda. The Pentagon also has now joined Canada in needing to review shady digital age propaganda operations, because these are, have been exposed as having spread misleading information. So there's a need to regulate the private industry firms they hire. A lot of this was being blamed on the contractors, not necessarily being subject to sufficient oversight. And we need to be thinking about our own practices. So if we're trying to build trust, we may need to answer the question, how light is our gray? Now, to introduce that, governments are developing and using AI-driven ways of identifying disinformation by behavior online for fighting information wars today. And the rising distrust and hack and leak attacks that I talked about are moving underground and becoming less transparent. In an interview, the former director of the communications division at NATO told me that grey is honest and truthful. And this is generally the bulk of these operations these days. But you may not say who or where it's coming from. He said, to some degree, the whole of the communications area now is grey. Because there's a lot of use of these profiles, these personas online that may be faked personas and so on, or maybe organizations that are a cover for the original actor. So the ethical question around what democracies should be doing becomes, how light is your gray? Democracies need to be considering the limits and ethical boundaries for our own propaganda as it evolves, if we want to undermine authoritarian efforts to exploit distrust in our societies. And only trust building and de-escalation will counter the conspiracies and efforts to create paranoia. Reconsidering government's responses towards regulating and protecting different actors is also necessary. So I would argue that we need to shift away from thinking about dis, and malinformation and think about the particular actors, because, by the way, some of these organizations are far more hostile and problematic than others. Making misinformation and disinformation the problem, patterns of falsehood, for instance, all become equally threats from malign actors. So this then is used to increase paranoia in society. So we've seen in the United States this real concern around the way that misinformation, so unintended falsehood, is being tackled alongside disinformation in the same agencies and the same programs. And really tackling unintended falsehood online, this should be an educational thing and something for journalism and public literacy efforts. Disinformation is a whole new ballgame and is much more complex. And we are missing the motives, the actors, the organization, the ideology and emotion that are behind all of this when we are reducing it to these frames. Organization, traditionally, we would have said, is the mobilization of bias. Some issues are organized into politics while others are organized out. This is a classic phrase in understanding power in politics. But in showing the way in which particular interests are mobilized in and mobilized out of propaganda planning and organization, this is of great importance in determining the responsibility, the intent, and the function of propaganda, the core aim of which is to mobilize bias in public information. So we need to bring back the understanding of organization, and that might also involve responding and to create a society that is more where it's more difficult for any of us to exploit some of these concerning practices, because we have created an infrastructure that we use for our influence operations, which is also being used against us, as was done with Cambridge Analytica. So these reputation laundering mechanisms, shell companies, cryptocurrencies and dark money, hidden lobbying, and so on, which are used to hide operations, and the use and abuse of different jurisdictions, all need to be taken on in order to strengthen the infrastructure for democracy. Because if we allow these practices ourselves, we are going to be creating institutions that will be weaponized against us. So tackling today's propagandists, actors today who influence and their motives have become an afterthought in counter disinformation, a problem of identification which is too hard to solve, because what we see are the campaigns online, not those behind them. Well, we need to reverse that. We need to be focusing much more on those behind the campaigns. Without knowing who's behind the falsehood, it's difficult to know their intentions, whether it's a misinformed public or deliberate actor, and their overall strategy. Foreign and domestic campaigns can look similar online, and foreign actors adopt domestic narratives. But there are big differences, of course, between a citizen sharing genuinely held false views and the Russian IRA trying to divide us. Accountability is vital for those deliberately misleading, and it's also key to trust. So I want to here present you with an example from 2016 in the US, which was exposed by the FBI through Congress. And this was two groups that were set up by the IRA for purposes of digital subversion. So this is the practice of using clandestine or covert activities for co-opting and infiltrating groups, as well as manipulating tensions in order to destabilize or otherwise influence a population. As you can see, these two groups were on both sides of an internal domestic conflict, and one of them was aiming to pull in people sympathetic to the Black Lives Matter movement. The other was for the Blue Lives Matter movement. So the social campaign around defending the police on the conservative right in the United States. So this these pages were used to try to organize protests, actually brought people out onto the street in the United States. And they were used also for intelligence gathering, data profiling, as well as pushing out propaganda. But the key thing, of course, and this also happens in Ukraine too, is the whole point of this was to not solve the issues of these particular groups. And I think this is something that is not said enough. And you don't necessarily see that when you look at the posts themselves superficially. You need to understand the actor behind it to understand that actually this isn't intended to solve the issue of the people that are in that group. They are being manipulated deliberately to make the conflict that they are a part of more protracted. So the policy, the people who are joining these groups probably want certain policy outcomes to protect their people, to defend the concerns that they have about their own society. Those things are literally just being manipulated to drive them against each other. And I think that often audiences don't see this and don't understand because the focus is not on the actors behind it and their purposes. So this MDM, mis, dis, and malinformation, it tends to treat unintended misinformation as part of the same problem. And it can risk free speech as well. It's really important that audiences, though, understand that actual actors behind, deliberate misleading campaigns have an agenda that is currently being hidden when we talk about mis, dis, and malinformation. Yet history's witch hunts around overly expansive definitions of participation of audiences in propaganda that embrace propagandists' targets as active in their subversion need to be a warning to us now. The public being targeted aren't the problem here. We must do more to expose, research, and understand those actors targeting and creating misleading campaigns and subversion in our societies, and the infrastructure that enables this and incentivizes and monetizes it. Thank you so much for listening. I hope I haven't gone over. As I say here, that you're not just an audience for my persuasion. I'm looking forward to hearing any questions that have been posted in the comments. Thank you, Anton.
Thank you so much, for illuminating this very important problem and issues. And it's really, in terms of Russian war against Ukraine, in terms of, bad educated people in digitalization process, in fact-checking process, and so on. Unfortunately, we have just several minutes, but I really hope we will we will cooperate and we will continue our cooperation, and next time we will discuss more and more. But I have a little one question about beliefs. I mean, your thoughts. How much beliefs, like a part of ideologies, imaginations, and maybe invisible enemies are influence or on process of disinformation and proliferation and sharing these types of information? Thank you.
So beliefs, well, culture more broadly is obviously central to propaganda. And if you want a propaganda operation to have any effect at all, it has to fit the culture of the society that you are, not just the society, but the specific group. So if you look at this one, fundamental here are their beliefs about themselves, identity, and trying to, leverage these different histories that we have and the basis for which our beliefs exist in order to change, change our behaviors. And use our emotions. So our beliefs are closely linked to our emotions. And it doesn't almost matter what the beliefs are. These propagandists want to create a certain outcome. So whatever the beliefs are, whether it's, concerns about Hillary Clinton, where is it? And whether you believe she's corrupt or whatever, whatever your thoughts are on Hillary Clinton, they have a solution for you. And so this is why I think that these contemporary models are really just, simplistic, because it doesn't take into account beliefs, really. It's, the beliefs are almost irrelevant to falsehood. Well, actually, falsehood is irrelevant to propaganda in a way, because actually they're not trying to necessarily lie. They're trying to produce an advantageous behavior. Absolutely. or a belief that's advantageous. Yeah. And it doesn't matter if you believe something that's true or not true, just that you have the outcome that is desired by Russia or whatever the antagonizing propagandist is. So I think this is crucial. It's that actually propaganda is kind of agnostic as to whether you believe in things that are true or false. it doesn't care. It just wants to produce an action by you, whether it's to vote a certain way or to get you out onto the streets agitating. Now, it does, obviously, falsehoods are often more radicalizing. So if you want to polarize the world, to turn everything to black and white, that is not the real world that we live in. So there is obviously a relationship between falsehood and extremist propaganda and the sort of agitative propaganda that we see in these kinds of campaigns. And creating those divisive beliefs is a key to this kind of subversion where we are trying to, where an actor might be trying to create conflict. So it's in line with a particular kind of propaganda that is about creating conflicts between people. And I think this is key. It's like, but the beliefs that propaganda might create could be anything, really. It could be false or true. It just depends on what will move you. And that will be very individualized in a current environment where they have this degree of data on all of us.
Thank you. Thank you again. And unfortunately, we have no time, but I really believe and I really want and I hope you will share your thoughts with Kyiv School of Economics, with our master programs. Thank
you for having me here. If people want to check out the website, I'd be grateful.
Yeah, of course. And we will wait for our next meeting. I believe it will be. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so
Bye.
much. Bye. Thank you.